Alright, in this video we're going to take a look at protest and action against the apartheid state. Now, let's start with the defiance campaign and why it was launched. Well, they needed some type of response. Response was needed to a system of segregation that was much more extreme than the past governments. They need to act now before it's too late, before too much is set up, that there's no possible way that they can get democracy as everything is piling up against them. And this new government had no desire to work with the ANC, so they had to be forced to the negotiating table. Early on they tried one-day strikes, but those didn't really catch on. They didn't create a popular resistance, so they needed to organize a bit more. And the ANC is going to lose credibility and eventually just die out, and other organizations would take over if they didn't act, if they didn't do something. So younger, more radical members of the group started to take over. This is the first major national campaign designed to apply pressure on this government and force them to repeal laws, force them to negotiate with the ANC for change. As I mentioned, the ANC youth, the younger, more radical members start to take over, and in 1949 they came up with the ANC Youth League Program of Action, and included these ideas that they're going to start to implement amongst the entire ANC, including use the masses of ordinary Africans in a campaign of civil disobedience. And so it's not just going to be the rich and the middle class working, it's going to be the poor need to be involved as well for real change. And so early on it'll just be ANC leaders and other volunteers breaking the law in front of crowds of supporters, hoping to get them involved later on. Nonviolent civil disobedience would highlight police brutality and really put the South African government in the world spotlight. So they're going to use the judgment of the world, giving the ANC a moral victory. They're very similar to Gandhi's ideas. Speaking of Gandhi, they also want to fill the prisons and really push the legal system to the breaking point, the way that Gandhi did. And they want to work with other races, including the South African Indian Congress. And so this is a multiracial fight against apartheid. And so how does it start? April 6, 1652 was the when John van Riebeeck landed at the Cape. This is now the 300th anniversary. And so the National Party organizes huge celebrations for the Afrikaners, not so much for the Africans themselves. So the ANC organizes mass rallies in major cities on the same day. And so the Afrikaners are celebrating their big 300th anniversary, and the Afrikaners are saying, well, maybe it's time for change. And these rallies are pretty big, and this encourages them to create more action, to make more change. So a couple months later, in June 1952, the National Action Committee is created to organize this larger campaign. And this is going to include the African National Congress, and they'll be the majority, the South African Indian Congress, which is another influential group, as well as the Franchise Action Council, which is a very small colored group. The National Volunteers Board was created to kind of work together and coordinate these protests, and Nelson Mandela was appointed volunteer-in-chief of the National Action Council and the National Volunteers Board. So Mandela kind of starts his career with the ANC, really moving forward as a kind of a young man at this point. The campaign is set to start June 26, 1952, which is the second anniversary for the day of protest. This was an earlier protest where 19 protesters were killed by the police. The overall goal of the Defiance campaign is to repeal 6 of the most atrocious apartheid laws, including the pass laws. And so here we have Mandela burning his pass book, Group Areas Act, the Suppression of Communism Act, the Bantu Authorities Act, Separate Representation of Voters Act, and the Stock Limitation Act. That's one I haven't talked about too much. Didn't really affect people in the cities, but it affected people in the countryside. Under the Stock Limitation Act, this forced rural Africans to give up some of their cattle so that grazing land could be used for housing, which was very, very unpopular because for generations cows are going to be used as a sign of wealth, used to survive in the downtimes, and all of a sudden they have to limit the amount of cows they can have, so it's going to anger the poor quite a bit. So general strikes would later on be added in to add pressure, because you always want to have a boycott to add that economic pressure to create change. This all started with an ANC meeting in Johannesburg, and where these main leaders stayed out past the curfew, which is already, as a sundown town, illegal. And so they divide the laws in view of cheering crowds and police. So they're burning passbooks like this in front of cameras and crowds. They're going to walk into segregated amenities. So they'll walk into restaurants and bathrooms and such. They'll enter white areas and white suburbs without required passes. They'll stay in whites-only areas after curfew, and that's how this whole thing starts. Doing all this out and open in the public so everyone can see. That's the whole idea of civil disobedience. You need witnesses. In most cases, if they broke the law, they'd be sentenced to a day in prison, and they'd be given a small fine. And they just do this over and over again, getting more and more people to break these small laws one by one out in the open to get the media coverage. Repeat offenders would get longer sentences, so organizers tended to be part of the crowd after their first arrest. Public response was pretty positive. This spread through protests across the country. A large amount of Africans and Indians and small amounts of colored and white representatives were included. And the ANC membership grew significantly from 20,000 to 100,000 within the year, so really big growth for them. Women started to become more involved in the movement, with the ANC Women's League organizing acts of defiance, and we also started to see the rise of the Black Sash, which is a group of white women opposed to apartheid, and that'll be another help too. Peak of the protest is going to be July and August of 1952, so it's rather brief. It starts in June, July and August. By October, it all comes crashing down, however. Rioting breaks out. Likely this was pushed out by the government and that the government provoked a riot. And this gave the South African government an excuse to crush the movement. So they passed the Criminal Law Adjustment Act to introduce longer sentences for any act of civil disobedience. And they introduced public whipping as a punishment for the protests. So they go pretty extreme to stop protesters. The ANC organizers are now banned from meeting with each other through the Suppression of Communism Act. So the ANC decides to end the campaign. So here's a little image of the riot that really ends this defiance campaign before it can really get going. Was it successful? Did it work? On the no side, they didn't really achieve their goals. No laws were repealed, and worse laws were added. The more repressive laws were added. It really was only supported in the big cities, and so the rich and middle class heard about it. In Johannesburg, East London, Port Elizabeth. The rural areas were really not involved. Poor people were not involved as they could have been. The general strikes that would have attacked the economy never happened. It was just all planned for later, and then the riots happened. Most of the ANC support came from middle to upper class Africans. Working class Africans were barely involved in this case. They watched, and then that was it. Very little support from the colored community, as in where they are the majority in Cape Town, where their population was highest. Not much was happening there. And the white community was largely hostile to the campaign, especially after the riots, and that they just saw these as troublemakers and not people looking for democratic change. English press did not really cover it, so it didn't really make the world press, as they saw this as too extreme, too radical and confrontational. And after this, the whites-only election of 1953 kept a national party in power, so we didn't get too much change. On the yes side, as far as was this a successful campaign, on the other side, it's a first step. It's the first major step for the ANC. The ANC has been around for a while, has had little protest, but this is the first major campaign for protest that they've had to face a pretty tough system. And the ANC is going to learn from their mistakes from this campaign, as far as not including all races as much as they could have, not including poor people as much as they could have. And so it's a first step. They did get thousands of middle-class volunteers showing up ready for action. And this shows of what they can do later on. And they show that we can get a coalition of different groups working together. Communists, Indians, unions, women, all working together. And later on they're going to get more groups involved and working together. More people start to recognize the ANC as a big organization, nationally and globally. The name of the ANC gets out there. The name of Mandela gets out there. And it does raise the attention of the United Nations. In 1953, the UN establishes a commission, so kind of a group to watch for the racial situation in the Union of South Africa. So this starts the international campaign against apartheid. So the UN starts to watch South Africa a little bit closer for problems like this. So So here we have a group of women helping out and protesting as well. Another example is the Congress of the People, leading to the Freedom Charter. The goal of the Congress of the People was an alliance of anti-apartheid congresses convening in 1955 with their goal of, one, creating a singular popular front, or kind of all the different anti-apartheid groups coming together, all races against apartheid. So you just wouldn't have the African National Congress and the Indians over here, everybody's together. In this case, it's also going to include the colored population because their voices didn't come out the last time. They want to expand the membership of the ANC to really involve poorer Africans because they're learning and they want to include them too to create bigger changes. And they want to draft a freedom charter. They want to kind of set up a constitution with their political goals, what they want, almost their Declaration of Independence, and their main ideas. This starts in 1953, proposed by Professor Z.K. Matthews, right here, and ANC President Chief Luthuli, right here, and he's going to be kind of one of the main leaders throughout this campaign, Chief Luthuli. So this idea was approved by the African National Congress and then later on endorsed by the SAIC, South African Indian Congress, the Indians, and the CPC, Colored People Congress, the South African Communist Party, the South African Congress of Democrats, which are, they're not quite communist, they're white leftists, so closer to what Democrats would be in America, as well as the Congress of Trade Unions. So a wide range of groups is supporting this. 1954, the Congress Alliance is formed, so all these different groups decide to go forward and create the National Action Council to kind of get this together. And the National Action Council sends out volunteers across the country to spread information about the masses, to let everybody know, hey, here's what we're doing. Hey, do you have any complaints? What do you want your country to look like? And so these people go across the nation collecting information as far as what they're going to do. Then they start to have meetings across the country. There are a few big rallies, but mostly, and rightly so, more effectively, is going to be these small meetings in homes, small meetings in factories, to get closer to the people. So it's better to have a whole bunch of small meetings so that more voices can be heard as opposed to one mass rally. You might have one speaker and a whole lot of listeners. And so they're going out encouraging everyone to join the Congress, get involved in these protests, and listen as well. And so the grievances of ordinary people are collected, and they also collect the signatures of these people in what's called the Million Signatures Campaign. So this huge document, including all these complaints, all these people saying we want change. And they set up committees to incorporate the suggestions of the people into one big document of the goals for the African people in their Freedom Charter. And so, the peak of this big movement is the June 25th, 26th meeting with a mass rally at the Kliptown soccer field in Johannesburg. 2,844 delegates, so all the different representatives from across the country meet. So each representative is representing their community, and they all meet in this huge soccer field. The ANC head, Luthuli, was banned from attending, but his message is read out loud to the community before proclaiming that they've got the Freedom Charter, and they read out the Freedom Charter of their goals, what they want. And so they're calling for an end to the apartheid. They want the election of a democratic and non-racial government, that everybody's included. They want the equitable distribution of South Africa's wealth and resources. And so just some big ideas going on here. And we'll take a closer look at each of these ideas later on. The armed police show up, they collect documents, take pictures of lots of people, they raid the meeting, arrest several of the delegates, and seize those documents for evidence. At this point, the South African government starts to take down the resistance movement, first legally. And so the treason trial begins in 1956. They put 156 of these people, and these are the main leaders, on trial. And they're arguing that the Freedom Charter proves that the ANC was trying to overthrow the government. And they want change in the government, and so their evidence was pretty weak. And with very little evidence, after several years of this long trial, by 1961, all the 156 people that are accused walk off because all they prove is that they want change. They don't necessarily want to overthrow the government. They don't want that kind of extreme movement. And a little bit on bus boycotts. It's a major form of black protest we see across South Africa, first observed In 1943, Nelson Mandela is on record as marching into Johannesburg with thousands of protesters. And usually it wasn't a planned thing. This was just a natural reaction to increased fares from the townships to the city. So it's related to the fact that you have these really poor Africans who, under the apartheid laws, couldn't live in the city, so they had to commute on the buses for up to 20 miles from the townships. And so just a little budget increase is going to really mess with their daily lives. And so they very quickly set up a committee to negotiate with the bus company and coordinate these boycotts to create a change. In 1944, these boycotts are getting bigger and bigger. 20,000 people boycott the buses in 44. And usually these boycotts are pretty successful. If nobody rides the buses have to react or they're going to lose their company. And in many cases, the Johannesburg Chamber of Commerce, Johannesburg is a major center because it's such a big city with a lot of townships around it. And so the Chamber of Commerce, kind of the representatives of all the businesses, would intervene, stop the bus company saying, hey, you need to fix this because this is messing with our business now. And because a lot of the workers from the different townships are showing up to white-owned businesses late, or they're tired from walking 20 miles. And so it impacts productivity. It hurts businesses in Johannesburg, so all the businesses turn on the bus companies. This influenced the early ANC strikes, as well as the Defiance campaign. This could not be started by the ANC, but usually it's only reaction to these increasing fares. And there's more of these boycotts in 49, 50, 54, 55. And so here's a couple riding into town. The big one to know is the Alexandra bus boycott of 1957. So the bus company is Putco, and they raised their fares by just one little penny. But it's going to have a big impact already because the annual fares as they were, I believe it was 4, moving up to 5 pence. And already at 4 pence, the annual fares added up to 1 month of wages for the entire year. So it's a huge chunk of change to ride the bus. And if you just increase that a little bit, they're already poor. They don't get paid very much, and you're taking a whole lot more and something that they have to do for their job, and they have to live up to 20 miles away. And so hundreds of thousands of people boycott in this case. It receives a lot of good sympathetic coverage in the white media across the country. And we get a lot larger protests due to these increased political tensions resulting from forced evictions from the black spot communities, really increasing in 57 as the law gets stronger and more communities start to be evicted. Alexandra was targeted for this. It was a black urban community on the edge of the city. And so it's a clear target from the South African government who plan to get rid of it in the next 3 years. Plus, in 1956, women start to be issued these passes as well. So the women are going to be a little bit more angry now. And we also start to see the native authorities put into place in the reserves, where we start to put in these puppet dictators, and the people aren't happy about that later. So all these this anger from other apartheid problems is welling up in this anger towards the bus company. January 7th, 1957, it starts. Thousands march while singing freedom songs. So they're singing, they're very positive. It's not a violent thing. And they're singing songs of freedom as they march to work. And they start to, and the boycott spreads, other cities work together in solidarity with them. 70,000 people are walking daily and riding their bikes daily for up to 12 weeks. And on occasion, the police would stop marchers, ask for passes just to mess with them, and on occasion would even puncture bike tires to further mess with them. The Alexandra People's Transport Action Committee is set up to negotiate and organize the boycott. And so ANC leaders were going to be a major part of this negotiating team. But eventually, because it's affecting business in the city, the Johannesburg Chamber of Commerce intervenes with a deal. So Putco restores the old fares, and the government's going to make up the difference in costs. So the commuters win a nice little victory. Overall, the bus boycotts were seen as a threat by the South African government because they really couldn't control it. This was not organized by the ANC or any other political party. This was something naturally from the people. And it's just thousands of protesters showing up with little to lose. It's much harder to put that down. In most cases, they would blame communists or blame the African National Congress for intimidating the Africans into boycotting, but really this was just a natural thing. People are angry over these increased costs. The South African government worried this could start a pattern of protests that would only end with eventually the government having to make concessions. So they're really worried. Plus, a lot of the whites in the community started to turn against the government. White newspapers included daily reports that were sympathetic to the Africans. And a lot of the wealthier white people started to show up with their cars to offer free rides to African marchers. And so this is one of the first examples of white support that's not from the extreme branches of the communists or the Congress or the Democrats, and that we're getting a more moderate whites that are saying maybe we should change. And so we're getting more white support slowly. Pros and cons for the ANC. Pros, it showed that the South African government could not easily deal with a mass movement and that they didn't know what to do. Con, the ANC, and so we see the power of the people here. And on the downside, the ANC has difficulty in harnessing the power of the people unless they start it themselves. And so they have to figure out new ways to harness that power. And we'll take a look at some of those ways next week.